And just give people a chance to come in. Okay, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Yvonne Love. I'm an associate professor of art at Penn State and the Abington coordinator for the Studio for Sustainability and Social Action. I'm happy to introduce Stacy Levy today. I came to know Stacy's work in the early 90s while a grad student viewing Calendar of Rain, which literally collects and visualizes rainfall simply and elegantly in glass bottles, and sandblasted with the date of collection at Larry Becker and Heidi Niveling's gallery in Old City, Philadelphia. Stacy's projects explore sites, often in built environments, letting the materials tell the story, resting somewhere between art and science. To this end, she often works collaboratively with scientists, fluid dynamic engineers, and geologists. Stacy has an extensive list of commissions, including East Midtown Greenway, East River Park, New York, Walton Art Center, NEA Art Our Town Grant in Fayetteville, Arizona, Independent Seaport Museum in Philadelphia, the Mussel Hatchery Exhibition and Mussel Field Station at Fairmount Waterworks in Philadelphia, and solo exhibitions including Larry Becker Contemporary Art, Philadelphia, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, Lafayette College of Art Gallery in Easton, PA, Swarthmore College, Towson University Art Gallery in Towson, Maryland, and many awards and fellowships, including a Pew Fellowship of the Arts, NEA Our Town grants with the Schuylkill Center for Environmental Education for Rain Yard, Henry Meigs Environmental Leadership Award, Penn Future Award for Women in Conservation. It's my pleasure today to introduce Stacy Levy.
Thanks. Great. Thanks, everybody. Good to have you here on this beautiful day. I'm sorry I'm keeping you inside, but I hope in talking about water that you'll have something to bring back outside with you too. I'm going to go directly to my PowerPoint screen. Okay, we're going to share. Participants can now see your application. I can see my desktop too, which is truly, it's the desktop of an artist. Okay, now we're going to view this in slideshow, and you give me a thumbs up if you can see. Let's see, everyone's on mute. I'm just going to assume that you can see things. So today I want to start with acknowledging that I am currently living on land stolen from the Susquehannock and the Shawnee, the indigenous people who used to inhabit this piece of Pennsylvania, and were displaced by European settlers in the 1700s, both by the settlement and by the diseases that the Europeans brought. We're mindful of a history of broken treaties and grateful for the opportunity to steward the land now that is under our possession and steward it for many species by managing, in my particular case, 80 acres for a land of biodiversity. I am also in this watershed, and maybe after this, you hear this, you'll think about what watershed you perhaps grew up in and how it connects to one sea or another. But my watershed goes from Muddy Creek connecting to Penns Creek, which flows into the Susquehanna River, and to the Chesapeake Bay. So take a moment, just think about who used to live on this land and the interconnectivity of the watersheds flowing around us. Not all free waters, many of them damaged, and what we in time can do to have more consideration for these very same waters. I'll be talking about water today, and it's a subject that interests me greatly, always have. I grew up near streams in Philadelphia that I played in, and found out later that they were sewage swales that were heading down to the combined sewer outfall. And I just thought they were wonderful, even though they smelled a little bit, but they were filled with water during storms, and I had a lot of fun playing in them. But my connectivity to stormwater and sewage probably started there. I'm very interested in what we need to do to build better with water in mind. And I'm going to take you through some thinking and some projects because I can't chew gum and walk so easily at the same time, we'll do questions afterwards. But think about your questions and save them or write them up in the question period or in the question zone, and no question too big or too small. So I will sort of continue with everything here. Let me just get set up and slightly organized. No tea, I realize. Okay. So we've been living in a mythology of technology. We think it's just good, pure science, but it is a form of mythology. And we put technology above all other relationships that we have. And our relationships to waterways have really suffered in our adherence to thinking that everything can have a technological answer. Things about their flows and about their boundaries have been set in ways that water never would have accepted. And we've made that mistake. And so it's true that in the end, we're drowning in information while starving for wisdom. We live with these many natural aspects of our world, and we have no idea what they're doing. And one of the things we've lost track of is how we share the world with the natural world, which we are part of, but somehow feel very distinct from. And we've been thinking of it as a resource to extract something from, rather than a process or a series of processes, ecological processes that we're part of and are completely reliant on. I think we've always seen it as something separate where we can go and scoop out what we need at any expense to the system, and then hope that it might regenerate, or just simply move on and let it lay there destroyed, similar to mountain topping, to fossil fuel extraction, to coal mining in southwestern Pennsylvania, where all of these holes in the ground were just simply left by the bankrupt coal companies. And now these new wells and destroyed waterways will be left by the fracking industry. We have a particularly sort of tricky take on water because we like our water tame and delineated. This is the river in San Antonio as it's coming through the historic part of the town. And it really is basically a very lovely gutter. And I do love this river, but it has nothing to do with a natural waterway. Waterways don't stick between two lines that we draw for them with stone and concrete. Water has many, many forms and faces, and we don't really get its changeability. And we haven't ever lived with the idea that water needs to do many things on a site. We want it to do one thing, which is to flow where we told it to flow and not to jump its banks. And as we are experiencing climate crisis, this kind of control is getting more and more iffy. A much more precarious way to relate to water, because water is very mutable and it needs to change, it needs to expand, needs to soak in, it needs a lot of time to move through the landscape. And that's not something we've wanted to give it. So I've been thinking a lot about how we can change our relationship to water, not just by getting to know where we are on our watersheds, knowing our watershed address, but also actually changing the way we build with water in mind. So Anu Mathur is one of my favorite. She's a professor at Penn, and she's a wonderful speaker and thinker and writer. And she's really looked into how we see water and is very interested in ways of rethinking our relationship to water. We've established something that is no longer tenable. And she wonders, can new attitudes and techniques of visualization aid us in the creative endeavor of rethinking water? And I hope so, because that's what I'm setting out to do. I'm trying to figure out if there's a new way to visualize water, and that's what I'm using my art to do. And I want to create more connection to this essential element. And the idea that we are separate from water, which we certainly are not, being 97% water, that we no longer can segregate ourselves from nature, that we have to really see how entangled we are with nature, and technology does not keep us free from nature, is a very important first step. We know that the patterns of nature repeat at so many different scales, from tree limbs to watersheds, But we also need to know that we are not separate from these very patterns. They're inside us. It's the same patterns that carry the blood inside our bodies is what carries the river water throughout the land. So this flow pattern is very, very precious and almost sacred. And yet this is how we treat water when it's on the land, and that we need to move it from one place to another or control it in some way. It's disconnected, uncelebrated. There's no place for a relationship when you throw water in a pipe and hope that it won't do much more than just go from point A to point B. The places where we come into contact with water in this everyday way are extremely degraded. Just as you're driving along a road, you barely know when you're crossing over a stream or waterway. I certainly hate that Google Maps will tell you to veer slightly right to stay on the road, and yet you'll cross the mighty Hudson and it won't say a damn thing about that. And we have a sort of disregard for the water that we're living mostly over these days. Our typical engineered solutions just don't work anymore. And they have not addressed the real needs of ecology, which I've kind of boiled down so that I can make them portable and carry them with me in my thinking, that nature wants to be scruffy and soggy, not dry and smooth. And I think that art is going to play a very big role in a way to show us how we can share nature with our or share our built environments with nature. And as an artist, I'm doing a great deal of engineering. I'm working with engineers, but I'm also almost an engineer myself in the necessity of letting water do what it wants to do, letting it move where it wants to move instead of me moving it. I'm trying to think of different ways to address the site and expand the scope of what we build and where. And I'm also doing a lot of collaborating across disciplines. And I can't stress this enough, that the collaboration is very important. But we really need to look at new ways that we can live better with nature. We need more soggy, which is partially entails allowing rainwater the time and space to infiltrate into the soil. And we need more scruffy. We need to share our built surfaces with plants and with water. And water and plants are integrally tied together. So when I'm talking about water, in the end, I'm pretty much talking about plants, because they're fairly dependent on each other and their systems are intertwined. So the soggy, water in the landscape, water that we have inhales and exhales. And that's a funny way of looking at water, but it expands, it spreads out when there's a lot of it, like when it rains, and it contracts or inhales when it's dry, when there's not a lot of rain, when it's droughty. And we need to give water places where it can take the time to soak in. It needs time and space, and it needs to be undisturbed. One of the reasons that we invented pipes was to take away both time and space from water and say, go do your things somewhere else, which becomes dangerous. And I'll show you some examples of that. With the scruffy, we really need to share the landscape with vegetation. And I don't mean just the wild landscape, the rural landscape. I mean suburban situations and urban situations all need to share better with vegetation. And even the smallest tangle of shrubs supports a great deal more life than what we would otherwise turn the entire world into, which is the lawn, which is basically a desert except for its greenness, and humans happen to like it, and dogs like to take a crap on it. So we really need to design our built world to be more connected to nature. And I feel strongly that it's pretty much time to start practicing what we want the world to be, because it's not going to get there just by wishing it so. And so I'm looking at how collaborations across disciplines with artists and engineers and ecologists can jumpstart this change. We're a little late to it anyway, but we really need to get moving. So I do feel that art has a new role to play. It needs to solve site issues, perhaps in celebratory ways. I like to celebrate our relationship to nature, the wonder of nature, just the kind of cool aspects of it. And I like to bring us in closer contact with the natural processes that are occurring everywhere, even in the most urban, concretized and glass cities. The wind is still blowing through, blowing spores. Birds are still migrating overhead. Water is still moving through that city. It is raining everywhere when it rains, and that water has to go somewhere. So even super urban areas have a great deal of nature and natural process going on in them. In this case, I'm trying to think of ways that buildings can drink their own rainwater, be responsible for what falls on them, and not send it down the pike as they typically do. So I've been looking into how to create spaces that share the landscape with rain and with people. I know I am not a proponent of taking people out of the equation. I'm a proponent of us learning to live better with nature and to be more equitable with nature, to share more. So one of the things that I've gotten into thinking about is the sort of bunk bed approach, where the rain gets to go down onto the lower bunk and the plants come up from the lower bunk to the upper bunk, and our feet stay dry as we walk on the upper bunk, and yet we can enjoy nature surrounding us. We're not so separate from it, but we're kept dry. But this being more equitable and sharing more equitably is very important. We're terrible sharers as humans, and we're not very good sharing amongst ourselves, and we're particularly bad when we share with nature. So changing that paradigm is very important. And the solutions that I've been creating often take two angles. They utilize the processes at work in nature, the sort of ecological processes that are happening on the site where I'm working. I am a site-specific artist. I sort of don't make much unless you give me somewhere to make it. The second thing is that we need to share the space with people's needs and the needs of the ecological process. And I believe that they can come together. I'm often told, oh, that's never going to work. We need too many parking spaces. You can't put your piece in here. But I think there are a lot of ways to learn how to share better. And there's a great deal of engineering in these pieces. They have to be engineered so that the rain can have time and space to infiltrate the soil and not flow into the basement of the building where the infiltration is adjacent to. And as I've said before, the work's not done alone. Artists are working with ecologists and engineers. And I think this is a very exciting move that art is taking, from departing from the sort of go into your studio and come out with something after you spend a lot of time by yourself. I am sort of more of a herd animal, and I like to go out and work with a lot of people and make a piece sort of as we go. So I believe in art has a possibility as a group activity also. Not that it's by consensus, I'm still the artist in the situation, but the fact that it has a lot of different disciplines informing it. And I also, when I'm building these pieces, need a lot of community support and volunteer labor, because sogginess is not well funded. The reward of this kind of work is a wetness diversity, places that are soggy, places that are dry, places that can be something different depending on how much rain has fallen. There's a great deal of beauty to it in the natural diversity of plants. And it's a system that's actually at work with natural processes that are going to occur anyway. It's not fighting the natural processes. And you get some wonderful spaces that can be used as outdoor classrooms and places to celebrate rain in the landscape, something we've stopped doing. When I was little, I remember it pouring rain in second grade, and I would run out and just stand under the gutter, the broken downspouts, and get showered upon. And it was so amazing that this wonderful water was coming out of the sky. I don't do that too much anymore, and most people don't. So losing that joy of rain is sad to me, and I'm trying to bring that back in. Porosity is very important. And porosity, the idea that something can flow through something else, it welcomes the rain. Whereas our hardscapes, which are not at all porous, push the rain somewhere else, allow it to run off to a downslope stream. So changing these small relationships so we have it, or making small changes to our relationship with water is very important. Celebrating the natural processes, making space for these processes to happen or flourish, and also making really great spaces for people, though often much smaller amount of space than they had before, but a higher quality space. So I'm always thinking about how we can invite the soggy and the scruffy into our built environment. How do we share these kind of places with nature? This is a project along the Delaware River, dendritic decay gardens, and I'm trying to figure out how to make it more scruffy and soggy too. One of the things that people who are keeping concrete in pristine condition are always trying to get the vegetation out of the concrete and are constantly burning it or poisoning it or pulling it out by hand. But if you like concrete, you don't want vegetation. So I adopted the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I'd get more of that in there. I'm borrowing a process and making it active and visible through art. It's a visual biomimicry of freeze thaw, where the rain gets in and starts to, then it freezes and expands and it starts to break up the hardscape. So I've taken this section of along the Delaware. It's the Washington Avenue Green, a park that was just being created. I'm drawing the watershed on these very hard shoulders, industrial shoulders of the river, which should not be, there should not be industry going right up to the river. It should be much softer with vegetation, and making a garden out of a parking lot. And so now the industrial shoulders are sharing a little bit of their space with vegetation. And this, in this case, was native vegetation we planted. All sorts of other non-natives came in, but basically whatever could grow was allowed to grow here because green was good. This is 3 growing seasons later. You can see how it's filled in, some of them native, some of them not, but the natives have prevailed. And these are other site issues that are happening, is that every surface that we drive our vehicles on becomes coated with all sorts of oily residue, petroleum residues, and other pollution from just simply tires and the rubber of tires. And all of that gets washed wonderfully by the rain and then taken right in, it flows right into the local creek or river, whatever's next to these surfaces. So I'm trying to create a kind of urban buffer zone so that the water isn't going directly into the river, into the streams, but the plants that are growing along these swales are filtering the oil and other petroleum pollution that's in the runoff. So maybe what's being made here is a series of urban waterways, rain gardens that are now in parking lots, swales, which are kind of like new urban streams. And that could be a way of seeing these paved expanses that we seem so happy to live with. This part of the dendritic decay garden takes the broken up concrete. We didn't want to take all the concrete off the surface and just take the concrete to the dump, because that seemed very unsustainable, and we needed to really experiment with the idea of maybe you can't move this stuff, you have to deal with it on site. You can see the line striping in these on these pads because they're literally from the parking lot. And it takes a while for these projects to grow, almost always 3 years with perennials. That's the sleep, creep, leap is the 3rd year of perennials where they really take off. And these pads of concrete turn out to actually reduce the compaction of the roots, which is very helpful for growing things in a highly populated area. It's a changeable landscape throughout the season, unlike a green lawn, which is green no matter what you do to it. And the scruffy is so much more interesting than lawn and continuous concrete. There's something that's always happening, and it's also so much more interesting to other species of insects in particular. So I feel strongly that even a small piece of the living world is better than none at all. And I notice how kids gravitate right towards puddles and to little areas of trees. And we need to be responsible to people. If they need that, we should be building it. And here we have, it's a school in Philadelphia that has a monoculture of this worthless surface called lawn, which does nothing to infiltrate nor support any species except maybe earthworms, which are not native. So I'm trying to take this site and to create conveyance of the water from roof down to the ground and infiltration so the water can soak in. I'm trying to keep the rain from going directly to the creek. And one of the things is we're going to have to deal with is a lot more rainfall in places that are temperate, such as the East Coast. Due to climate crisis, we're going to be getting a lot more rain. It's going to happen more frequently and with more intensity. And we need to figure out how to deal with all of that rain coming out of the sky and to give it the time and the space that it needs. So here this sort of maps out that it rains, and then the rain is taken down the pipes. The pipes are just sort of a show for the 40-mile-an-hour traffic just outside of this rain garden to see that there's something happening here. The real work is happening in the green below in the infiltration stage. And what happens if you don't infiltrate, if you send everything in a pipe straight down to the stream, is you pump a tremendous amount of water into the stream, and it just like Drano, it just goes through the stream and scours out, carves out the bank, scours out all of the microorganisms that are clinging to rocks, and completely changes the ecology of the stream, making really crappy habitat. So we want to prevent that by giving the rain a place to infiltrate and creating other sort of waterways with a river of iris, perhaps a shoreline of asters. So it's a kind of redemption of the scruffy. I'm creating more biodiversity wherever I can, making more space for both rain and plants, and a lot less space for people. You probably don't remember, but this whole area was a lawn. You could go there if you wanted to, but nobody wanted to go there. It was a horrible space. It was just a green expanse of nothingness. Now it's a much tinier space. It's probably a fifth of what it was in terms of where people can be, but it's a very popular space now because people can read and be among flowers and bees and just have a more enclosed and more depthful relationship with the nature around them. So this idea that we need to share our real estate with rain is very, very critical, and that we can enjoy the new spaces that we create, which maybe aren't as expensive, but are far more interesting. So in this case, I'm really trying to use art to make new solutions that are working with natural processes such as falling water. And art has another superpower, which I like. It can be a visual and conceptual tool for understanding change in the environment, which is always happening in nature. It just isn't standing still. And I feel strongly that we can make art that's less like a noun, less something that sits there and gathers dust, and more about being a verb. That's why I'm very interested in dust itself and how it's made. Something that can show change and respond to change. So my pieces are often very mobile and do a lot of changing. And why do they do this? It's because even though I studied a lot of ecology in school and forestry and read a lot of graphs, I don't get this information in my heart. I look at the graph like this, I go, and I don't feel it. I don't get it viscerally. So I wanted to figure out ways to diagram and graph changing conditions in nature using art instead of the tools of science. And I'm trying to figure out, can I make graphs and data come alive in these site-specific works? This is in Easton of the Bushkill stream. It's typical water level. And this is how it diagrams the change in water. It hangs down like an eye. If there's not much going on in the creek, it hasn't been raining very much. At fast flow, you get a sort of C pattern and then an L pattern after a high flow when the other waters are sort of backed up. And you can see that in action there. So there's the I and the C and the L. So I'm diagramming change over time. And it's really important to make these giant diagrams, because otherwise people don't remember change. All the students that are going up to Lafayette College are passing this creek, and it's like, wait a minute, it looks slightly different, but I can't quite remember. It's hard to register this. So the art becomes a registration so that people can get a better understanding of change over time with this visual indicator. And a lot of things that are hard to see do well being shown to us by a register that's artful and, made as art, which is also showing change. This is on the Hudson River. This is at high tide. The flowers, these tide flowers, are blooming. And then at low tide, they sort of close. And it's like, so what if we know what the tide is? But I think it's a curiosity. I've always wanted to know what the tide is when I'm passing by. But now the tides are becoming extremely critical to our safety in cities. If we get hit by a big storm and there's a high tide, as there was during Sandy, there's far more damage to the city. And we've become afraid of tides, and we're starting to create walls against them, where I think that we should learn to live with them. It's an ever-changing situation that you can actually build for. And we should consider our relationship not one of trying to stop the tide, but one of trying to live with the tide. Another urban tide is on the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. This is a project that was done with Bartram's Gardens. And very few people know that this river has a tide. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I didn't know until my mid-20s that there was a tide that was on this river. It rises and falls 6 feet 2 times a day. This is extraordinary. And it's like, had no idea. So instead of this is a typical tide chart, which is beautiful, but unless you open it in your phone, it doesn't give you any real feeling, and you don't see it when you're right next to the river. So I wanted to make a tide chart that was in the actual river itself. And this is what the chart is, and you can see it in action. At high tide, only a few of the buoys are apparent. A third of the buoys. At half tide, 2/3 of the buoys are apparent in an arching formation. And then at low tide, the entire strand of 9 buoys lays out across the surface of the water, giving us a sense of where the tide is. While you drive across that blue bridge, you can look over, if you're not driving, but a passenger, you can look over and see where the tide is at any time that you're passing by, which is something that you otherwise don't know. And these are out of the river now, and I miss seeing them. So learning about the tide as you jog or drive by is really great. And I'm revealing a pattern that fishermen tend to know what the tide is, and boaters know what the tide is, so they don't get stuck on sandbars. But everyone else is kind of at a deficit of information and of pleasure. This is another project. You can see these buoys keep turning up because they're very utilitarian, and they get recycled project to project. This is in Pittsburgh at Point State Park, and my art here is addressing an issue of these 2 rivers joining and how they're different. It's the Monongahela is joining the Allegheny to become the Ohio. And art is introducing this rather hard to see concept of the 2 different watersheds joining with different sediment loads and different currents. And there's just a map of what we're doing. Very different temperatures too, different pollution levels also. So this showing this natural process through something very tangible, not a chart or a graph that you're picking up with your phone or used to pick up with a sort of booklet that you would have, but something that's out there for you. And I do find when I'm doing this work, I have to be very flexible in the lesson that I'm trying to teach, because sometimes it shifts. Water is like that. I started talking about river currents, but I realized that the real lesson that this project could show people, could visualize, was about wave action. And that the idea that when you stand at the shore, the water that you see out there is not coming towards you, which I also always thought in my callow youth. The waves are not moving towards you. It's that every piece of the water is sort of popping up. And you could see this with the buoys. One buoy would rise up and then lower. The next buoy down would rise up and then lower. And the buoys did a very good job diagramming this wave action. Exactly like a stadium wave, when people stand up and then sit back down, that's the way water is working, but it's not what it looks like. So it was good to have that explained by this registration sitting in the middle of the river, and giving people a way to witness the river when they're down there. Or in Pittsburgh, wonderful city that it is, sort of on its second story, you could see it from the hills above. So art has a strong tradition of freezing the ephemeral, which helps make it visible, like Hokusai's A View of Mount Fuji, which is so much about this wave and this moment of water and splashing, which I just love. One of the ecological processes that I'm particularly interested in showing is the Kármán vortex street of vortex shedding. It's the fluid dynamics of how liquids move, and liquids and gases. It's a beautiful pattern, and it's pervasive throughout nature. Here it is in ocean currents. This is that sort of ochre color to the upper left is the east coast of the United States. And winds on Jupiter move the same way with that vortex shedding. And even in our cups of coffee and tea, when you stir in any kind of white substance into the dark substance, you get these extraordinary vortices. So how do you bring this kind of essential pattern into your everyday experience of place? And how do you sort of let people learn about this underfoot or physically, kinetically, experientially, that they might not learn about it if they had to read a plaque? So art's really great at making these visceral and experiential moments where people can really start to understand something about nature. Here, kids are climbing on hydrologically curved walls and riding bikes around carbon vortex streets. And these walls are very kinetic and experiential and kind of give a sense of swirling if you're small and running through them at the right speed. And you don't get wet. A lot of, in this particular neighborhood, a lot of these kids are not swimming in the river for lack of places of learning how to swim. And the river, this San Antonio River, is fairly dangerous and can get very, very deep in places. And so this is kind of like a dry place to think about water without having the danger of being in there by yourself. Once again, the sites are not built by the lone artist in her studio. I'm out there collaborating with land and building architects and planners, engineers, ecologists, and also educators often, where there's programming that will happen on these sites afterwards to engage people even more. But in this case, I'm bringing the hydrological patterns together with the floral patterns of the mission, the missions architectural patterning decoration that's throughout some of these missions that are in San Antonio. So it's a sort of, person-made floral and the nature-made hydrology. And I think it's really important to bring these ecological patterns into our everyday civic spaces. One of the things I did notice is that Art Nouveau, our patterns are extremely resonant of hydrological patterns. There's like a typical Art Nouveau, swinging back curves. And here's a carbon vortex street of this is how fluid dynamic. And it's like, God, they're spitting images of each other. So this sort of idea of freezing complicated aspects of nature and making them sort of wait there while we absorb them and get to study the pattern seems really important to me, and a great way for our public spaces to reflect the local ecology and for us to be able to learn from that reflection. This has been happening historically for a long time. Bringing the natural forms into architecture as a way of understanding your local ecology was happening in ancient Egypt, where all of the forms of the wet edges of the Nile were sort of built into the columns. And these are all about Nile River vegetation patterns and the different species that grow there. So this idea that you're witnessing your ecology in your built environment is not a new one. Here I am trying to show stream geomorphology. That's basically the shape of streams and how things develop. So another study in how to bring ecological patterns into our everyday. And translating these patterns of nature. In this particular one, I'm studying a creek. I'm studying how a creek forms itself with meanders and point bars and the stream bank hydrology, where the water's moving quickly and where it's moving slowly. So it's another art as a diagram. And art has always been part of diagramming natural phenomenon. People who were studying tornadoes were always doing these charts of how the trees broke off and how they lay on the ground after the tornado had passed through, which I love. This idea that you can live and walk on the diagram, in this case showing point bars or sand bars, gravel bars, and why it collects there because the water moves more slowly versus the deepest, fastest flow is to the outside, which is depicted in the swirling patterns. And of course, there are wonderful ways that the science is depicted in drawings. I'm quite a fan of scientific drawing, but these patterns are never where you need them. They're never right next to the thing or near the thing or in any way that you can run through them or walk through them. So I love the idea of making a diagram into a bodily experience and creating a kind of touchstone for pattern recognition. One thing about this pattern, these vortex patterns, is this is what's pushing the blood through your heart and closing the chambers in your heart. So this pattern is pretty important to all of our lives. And so I feel that we should know it and love it. Some parts of aquatic ecology in particular need a different kind of introduction because they are not appealing the way water in general is appealing. And they're not appealing because they're mushy or slightly smelly or gooey. And also they're very tiny and hard to see. So I have a lot of projects where I'm trying to sort of bring aquatic microorganisms into everyone's experience and give people a new way to appreciate them and to see your other neighbors. These are your microscopic neighbors that you don't think about when you're dumping your gasoline into the water. You're not thinking about your downstream neighbors, and these are them. And I think it's very important to kind of get to know them. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time in biology textbooks and which I love, but I want to put these textbooks into city streets so that we can sort of walk and read them as we go. And I'm taking microscopic views that you only see in the science lab, in the microscope, into this every day. So bringing the very specialized view you get as the scientist or the person who's taking science classes and bringing that out so it's next to a bus stop or part of everyone's commute, walking commute, is something very important to me. Ernst Haeckel introduced microorganisms to human society 130 years ago now, and which was completely taken by the extraordinary architecture that is in these life forms that was up until that point completely unknown and invisible. And people got so excited about it that they were making pavilions of these microorganisms. This is the radiolaria pavilion. That is something that is, you know, there might be 10,000 radiolaria in a grain of sand. So it was a moment of trying to bring this beautiful world that had just been discovered into people's everyday. So I'm quite a fan of that too. My modern take of here, I'm bringing the architecture of diatoms, the microalgae that are the freshwater mussels lunch, into display. This is at the freshwater mussel hatchery at the Fairmount Waterworks. And giving a way for people to relate to the parts of life that are gross and squishy and smelly and something you wouldn't necessarily want to touch, but sometimes by enlarging them and making them on a sort of sanitized surface makes them a little more available to people. And next time they see some algae, maybe they'll feel differently about wondering about what life forms are in that algae or the algae itself. So this tool, this tool, and I do say that art is a tool. I was thinking that that's a funny way of looking at it, though I'm a great admirer of tools. And I think it's wonderful that art can be a tool. It's fabulous for translating ecology into a legible form. It really is a translator. And it allows people to really witness and think about what's happening in their waterways. So I think it's very interesting that way. I do a lot of collected water projects where I take groups of people out to collect water from every single tributary, and then we map it in a gallery situation. So you learn about the tributaries, you learn about where things are, because everything has to be mapped out. We have to figure out how to get from, one tributary to another. And sometimes they're in terrible places. And sometimes you even get stopped and you're not allowed to collect water, but it's like you need to witness these waters. So we go and collect every tributary. Sometimes they're under the street, big culverted projects. Sometimes they're behind malls. Sometimes it's rather beautiful. In this case, in the Chesapeake Bay, we were going out to the bay in various areas collecting water. And you go out and then you bring it all back. But one of the nice things is both the obtaining of the water is very cross curriculum, and you can get, anyone who's interested in going outside can join in this process. So the science departments are often very active, and engineering departments are in there, and their art history is in there. And this time we even had, with Towson University, we even had the music department was was recording different streams, urban and more rural streams, and how they sounded differently. And there's very careful labeling of each of these tributaries, which are very hard won. And then we bring it back to the gallery and we pour it into the correct part of the map, and then end up with this huge liquid map, which is a way of experiencing the individual tributaries and also how they all connect. So you can really see where your backyard stream flows, where it flows and what it connects to. And you start to see, oh, that's probably why they put a bridge here, because it's narrower here. And you get a sense of the water quality too. It's a little bit misleading because clear does not necessarily mean healthy, but there is some water that's really in really bad shape, and it's quite apparent when you bring it into the gallery. It's under a sort of comparison, and against the floor, it's quite easy to see just how polluted some of these waterways are. So it's what we have here is an entire watershed that's been found or located, collected, and then mapped. And all of these different departments have converged with all of these different tributaries. So it's a nice kind of metaphor. And you get to know your watershed in a way that you probably didn't know it, because it's a human scale map of your watery situation that you probably didn't get before. We did a love letters to the waterways, where people wrote their memories or why they liked a particular stream or where they grew up. Because we feel strongly about our streams, and there's reason for it too. The world was a lot wetter and soggier before we built our cities, because one of the things that cities do is dry out our living situations so we can dependably have a dry area to walk upon and to have for storage and transport. But before concrete, the world was extremely soggy, and lots of streams meandered across the land. The soggy really did rule. And there's a reason it ruled. The beavers were everywhere, and the beavers are engineering a wonderful matrix of wetness, which is hugely supportive of lots of different species of vegetation, and then species that rely on that vegetation or that level of wetness. So this is where fish, it would be estuaries for fish, for insects, for birds to breed, because they had access to insects or small fish. And so it was an extremely rich land that the beavers created, that was a soggy area that supported a lot of life. But the beavers were basically killed for their pelts and reduced greatly in the colonial era, and we've never brought them back. And we've never brought them back because they embody too much sogginess, which we're pretty wary of. So I'm really interested in where the soggy used to be in our cities. Where was the landscape before we built our cities on top of it? And it turns out, this is Brooklyn, a piece of Brooklyn, that these historic waterways that used to meander across the land are still present. They're just inside of pipes some of the time when they feel like being inside of pipes, and they escape their pipes often too. But the idea that these streams can be revealed in simple ways, in this way, these are very short-term projects where the stream is revealed with chalk painting. And that kind of revival of the swirling patterns is very satisfying to do. The idea that this water is still swirling in pipes, sometimes loose, underneath these very tame streets. And the painting, it's fun to do a giant painting. So I will look at historic maps in order to find where the waterways were, and overlay them with modern maps to see how I can track them in the site that I'm working in. And we also, along with the maps, and we use other clues, like we listen into manhole covers and see if there's a steady flow, because sewers don't have steady flows of water. There's a huge rush in the morning when everyone's going to the potty and taking a shower, and then it settles down during the day. And if you hear water rushing through a manhole cover at, say, 2 a.m, when very few people are flushing or showering, you're hearing a stream. And then we map these, and then we remember them by demarcating them. And sometimes that evidence of where streams flowed is actually right there on the surface. In this case, this is 64th Street, East 64th Street in Manhattan. There was a puddle. It had been clear and rain-free for 2 weeks, and there was this massive puddle that was in the street right along the curve. And we realized that that puddle was being generated by the DeVore's Mill Creek flowing below. And all of the superintendents who came out and wondered why I was painting the street blue swirlies said, yeah, we are always pumping our basements on this block. I've never had that problem before and in other buildings I've worked in. And then a woman walks down the street and says, oh yeah, we're known as the mosquito block, obviously because there's standing water there, which isn't standing from anything else except a stream seeping up. So these streams are still present. They have not gone away. And water wants to flow across the land and it wants to make it soggy. It's seeking wetness. Meanwhile, that's rainwater. While rainwater is moving across the land, we're also having issues with the water rising. The ocean waters at the edges of our cities are rising and going to be reclaiming our paved shorelines that we thought we had controlled. All of the edges of this part of the world, of this mid-Atlantic part, this is in Flushing's, and in Queens, all of this was very mushy before we got there, before we started building our city. And so these edges that we consider very strict edges were not strict. The water was able to flow in and out over any kind of edge. And so I'm trying to bring into focus that these edges are not edges at all. And what was wet before will be wet again. So creating these basically life-size diagrams of what will be wet has been very important to get people to understand how things will change as our climate is changing. And this is a 4-foot level sea level rise. And what's being covered up. A great deal of Queens shoreline is going to be inundated. And there's a high tide future, what it could look like with a severely high tide with the changing water levels of climate crisis. And I think it's important to reveal the sort of extent of climate crisis and make it a little more real than it feels when you see a graph, the famous hockey puck graph of it getting hotter and everyone says, oh, sea levels will rise. But we don't really have a sense of what we're talking about. So seeing the park, the area where you park or where you ride your bike is going to be inundated is a very clear way of knowing that change is coming. And the ghosts of these historic waterways are going to come back, perhaps to haunt us or just to remind us that there will always be water here and it wants to do what it needs to do. So I'm also looking at how art can be part of ecological solutions. And another project that I worked on is a big urban lake that was very polluted, mostly by chem lawn and by chicken farms, and all the nitrogen and phosphorus that rolled off the land and polluted the lake. And in this case, I'm solving ecological problems with art and biomimicry. Now, I'm very influenced by this magnificent but rather scary piece, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, and which I always refer to as the Mona Lisa of earthworks, because it's what we all think about as environmental art, but it is not at all environmental. It was built in the environment and it engages, but it's not environmental. So I wanted to sort of take that form and make it into a different kind of art that would actually solve some of the issues on this lake. And with biomimicry, that this idea of trying to create more of the process that is working out in nature. Floating wetlands have been developed as ways of treating water, and they're used extensively and mostly in other parts of the world besides America, but they're starting to be used here to increase the wetlands, but they're not very interesting, visually interesting. But so I'm borrowing the function of a wetland with these floating wetlands and creating a living, breathing artwork that's floating on the lake. Juncus effusus is growing both up with its foliage and down with its roots, which is very important, all this root action. And it's creating a very great place for birds, really good habitat for birds and fish to be in the jungle below. And the turtles can slide up on here during the day and sunbathe. And it's protected from feral cats, which is hugely important if you're trying to do bird conservation. And it's a really fun destination if you're in a kayak. And as usual, it takes a lot of people to create these things. These have to be created on the surface of the water. They're a series of plants that are wrapped in coconut coir and then popped into this system, this mat system of closed cell foam mats. And then we towed it out in kayaks and anchored the mats. And it made me realize that every time we build for ourselves, we can also build for other species. So you can see the turtle coming up. There is wire on this to keep the geese out. I am selective about my species because the invasive Canada geese will completely eat every last living green thing on here if they're allowed to fly on here. So the idea that you can make something functional and beautiful and a space for more species than just yourself is something that's very interesting to me. So I'm trying to create these artful solutions, in this case, a solution to water pollution, which I'm collaborating with ecologists and engineers. And there's my chicken. That's not my chicken spiral, but I do love this. So we were talking a little earlier about pluvial flooding. That's rainwater flooding, pluvia from the Roman and pluie from the French. And it's going to be a lot wetter in our future on the East Coast. And so I'm always thinking about how buildings are going to deal with all this rain. This is in Pittsburgh. It's a part of a living building challenge, which is sort of like LEEDs on hormone, the LEED challenge on hormones. It's very serious about everything that goes into the building must be processed by the building. So in this case, all the rain from the roof is coming down this celebratory passage and goes down into wetlands where it's treated. And when I'm doing this work, I have to think about all the different conditions that the site's going to be in. And I was talking about the superpower of art, that it can show change. It needs to be great in all kinds of situations, and in this case, in all kinds of weather, wet, dry, and in between. So here's dry weather. It has a real presence. It becomes kind of like an amphitheater, a place to hang out. In wet weather, it's a sort of chadar of taking the water down and activating it, making it bubble and gurgle, and it's fun to watch and can be walked in also. And there's a lot of in-between time too, where it's a little bit wet and a little bit dry. But when you see that pattern that is that this piece is built from, it gives a kind of mnemonic to you about the landscape that you're going to walk into, because down below, the real landscape, the one that nature built, not that people built, is a delicate shale geology, which is gorgeous, but you could miss it. So this kind of sets you up to see those peeled away exfoliating forms, so that when you get down and see it, you might see it better by having it set up in your mind that way. So I am definitely a proponent that art is really giving us new directions for how to live with rain in the modern world. An architect may not be as free to do this, but I can suggest these things, and I have a little more leeway as an artist. So I take advantage of that position in society to push these ideas a little bit farther, and also to do a great deal of collaboration with other disciplines who really need some art thinking in their otherwise very ossified practices. So I'm very into the idea that we're going to invite nature into every setting that we create and celebrate water in all our built forms. This is, and many of you might have seen this, this is the Penn State Arboretum. You should go out there if you haven't seen it. Go out there in a rainstorm, because it creates a watershed in miniature when it rains. And the idea that we've always separated our professions. People talk about being siloed. This is a real problem, because when we separate our professions, we don't get to that third thing of blending two things. And it denies us a lot of possibility of finding better solutions than we've already come up with. If you look at engineering, you can see they've done some wonderful things, but they've done many, many stupid and pig-headed ideas about how you live with nature. If engineers would sort of open up their practices to thinking slightly differently and collaborating with landscape architects, with artists, things would look a lot different. And I think that's a big part of getting things to change, is that we do more cross-pollination, and that will be a way that we can get to some solutions. So if we want to be resilient and sustainable, we need to work across the disciplines and collaborate more, because we're working with a very powerful force. I used to work with a forester who said, nature bats last, and nature always gets the last word. You build something, it wipes it out with a flood. So unless we build carefully and we have more sharing going on with nature, our built environments are going to be overwhelmed, particularly with our changing natural conditions. So we need to learn to share our space better. And I'm hoping that we can use art to expand on ways to start by revealing our relationship with water, and to tell the story of how water works or nature works, to translate those patterns, and then work directly with ecological processes on site to work with the process instead of against it. So it's very important. I do feel like nature is watching to see what we're going to do, and that we need to start thinking very differently. So thank you very much for this hour. You certainly got an earful, and I hope that was interesting to you. I'd love to take any questions, and if we have time or anyone's game for it, I can show you a very sweet little video that was made about the tide fields at Bartram's Gardens as a way. I wanted to take everyone on a studio tour, and everyone's welcome out at a later time, a less COVID-y time, to see how I've been dealing with water on my studio site and my home front, and different ways that we've come up to live with water. But taking a sort of breathy walk through the landscape with the wind blowing the microphone didn't seem like such a great idea for today. So let's open it up to questions, and I will go, what do? I will just listen to whatever questions have come up. In fact, I'll look at the question and answers, and there are no open questions. So maybe I should look at the chat. Great. Oh, Bosch is here. Okay. Yvonne, do you want to unmute, or who's
Sure.
handling questions?
I'm happy to handle the questions. I don't
Oh,
see
very good.
any yet, but thank you. This was such a really, your work is so intellectual and beautiful at the same time. So
Thank
it's
you.
just a pleasure. Helen says, thank you, Stacy. This is such important work. It is such important work. I grew up with a naturalist father, and constantly, putting this into my head, even just, you don't run the water, and you take a shower with the bucket, and then you flush the toilet with the bucket water, and the whole, I've just grown up with conservation. So it's wonderful to hear from somebody else that's equally as indebted to our earth and the ways in which water moves through it.
Stacy, I always tell the students that art is the X-ray machine and not the doctor, but you're both. Both.
I think that's a really important thing. And it's funny that the spiral wetland, while I was building it, there was a moment of a real kerfluffle from the funders who said, wait a minute, this work is doing something. It's taking the pollution out of the lake water. It's not art then, is it? And that's definitely how I grew up. That was the measure of art. If it didn't do anything, it was art. And if it functioned, it was craft. And there was your line. And it took me years to undo that, to untangle that, and to say that that was just some stupid separation because people didn't know what they were talking about. It's like, if you say it's art, it is art. And art doesn't have to be, it just doesn't have to look pretty. It can do something too. And I think that's a huge change that needs to come across, because we've really hem-hocked art or fettered it by saying it just has to look like something, because it can look and do at the same time. And I certainly would have lost my interest if I only had to look a certain way. I really wanted to get my hands into some processes, and I just feel so strongly that art needs to be open to that, and that doing and being, and it can still be art.
Stacy, we do have a question. Once the projects are complete, who is responsible for the maintenance of the work if you do not live in that location? This
Oh,
is from
that is a
Saskia.
great question. And that's a huge issue in my life in general, because these works are most successful if the artist lives close by and looks after them themselves over years. And I just went to see a piece of mine that had been in the ground for 30 years. And, you know, parts of it have held up and parts of it haven't. Some of these projects are temporary to a year or two. And during that time, part of my budget goes to someone who's usually helping me make the piece, but is helping have a maintenance, is working on the maintenance of the piece on a very strict maintenance plan, where they check it out twice a week, and they might have a once a month work day of serious repairs. And if something comes up, they're out there for several hours doing repairs, and we're on the phone a lot. You can't make living pieces without someone helping maintain them, because like a garden, you can't leave it. Things happen, moles burrow in it, and weeds come up. So these pieces are very demanding with their maintenance. Now, there are times where I know I'm coming up against a long timeline, like it needs to be permanent, and I know that there won't be that many people working on it. And in that case, I utilize materials that are longer lasting and use more stone than vegetation. That's why the Frick piece, which is that kind of canyon-like ravine of stone, is more stone than landscape. There's also a landscape architect on board, and also our budgets are getting cut constantly. So the vegetation is escaping some of the places. But when something has to last, I have to make a lot of decisions about its future. And I know that materials that need less maintenance, such as stone and steel and glass, will be chosen because they will look after themselves. So there are times you have to keep the maintenance down. But the more living the piece, the more maintenance it needs. But maintenance it's good. Before COVID, we all cut our hair and things, and we take a bath, or, we do a lot of maintenance on ourselves and on our cars and on our driveways. I always am amazed. People are resurfacing their asphalt all the time, but nobody wants to maintain anything that's living. So I think that has to change too. Merle Euclid is working on
that. Stacy, I want to thank you also. This has been really wonderful. And I came out of can you hear me? Yes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I came out of another session with administrators of Altoona, Abington, and UP, and we're talking about what is changing for us in the university right around the corner. How do we go back? There's no going back to what it used to be. And all the metaphors you're using, I'm applying here for, the environment that we are going to be teaching in and working in. So you talk about porosity, and you talk about bodily, experiential ways of understanding all this information. I keep thinking, yeah, how are the buildings going to function differently? How technology is going to combine with the physical environment so we can teach and learn in a different way? And that's what I'm thinking all along. So a lot of your vocabulary and metaphors apply for so many situations, not just for how water flows, but how we flow also through this environment.
That's really true. Like information porosity is really important too.
Yeah, so I thank you for all the inspiration there. That was, amazing examples, and historical references. Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Do we have
any more questions?
I don't know. There's something on the chat. I was just greetings. Yes. All right.
Actually, I've got a question about the materials you use. You probably choose them for longevity, and what about their environmental? How much it costs to make them, or that's a very interesting question, because
I do bring and have brought a great deal of plastic and styrofoam into the world. I use those buoy pieces are styrofoam,
Right.
horrible material, very, very polluting to make. They are fishing buoys that are used down in Florida, mostly in aquaculture. And so I'm buying them off the shelf and I'm painting them, which is a way of kind of coating the surface so that the styrofoam stays stronger and doesn't chip away. And so one of the things that I do a lot of testing to see how archival things are by sticking them out in my landscape, which functions in two ways. It gets me to see, like, what does this look like when the wind's really blowing, or it's snowing, or it's 5 years old, or a bird crapped on it? What does it really look like? So I get to see it kind of set through its paces, but I also get to see, does it degrade? Is it falling apart? Am I going to be picking this out of the water? So I'm strict with using materials that don't degrade, but I do use a lot of things that have probably not a very pretty manufacturing technique. The closed cell foam that the wetland is on, I do not know how that is manufactured. When I was doing the Frick building of the Living Building Challenge, all of your processes have to be very carefully monitored. Everything has to come locally. Some things can only be 60 miles away. A few things can be farther. The one thing they could never figure out how to have made locally was wire for the electrical wiring. And that was the one thing that was outside of that jurisdiction. But and then I built with local stone, which is great, but also extremely expensive. I mean, one of the things about building with robust and sustainable materials is somebody better be willing to pay for that in the beginning. So that's something that I have to think about. Archival colors are really hard to come by. Plastic is cheap and bright, doesn't keep its color. The one thing that holds color is glass. And I use a fair bit of glass set into things, but it's also one of the most expensive materials, not to mention the most energy consumptive materials. So there's a lot of weighing out. It reminds me of the cloth diaper versus plastic diaper, disposable diaper conundrum. Is it better to pollute your water or better to pollute your landfill? So I think these questions are all very important, but truly at the same time, these small gestures are more important as mind changers and less important as sort of pure devices that did not use dirty systems. In the same way that I will be funded by all sorts of people that I wouldn't support normally. And unfortunately, art is like that, hence the Sacklers. And I've worked for tobacco companies in my day. I worked down at in Winston-Salem at a museum there, completely supported by donuts and cigarettes. But back to the major point is, it's sometimes more important to create something that will change many people's minds than for it to be a pure thing that won't ever get built or won't ever get seen, because it is not the individual who's going to change this world. It's the group that's going to change this world. And it's one of those things that I've really trying to come to grips with. And Yvonne, you were talking about like not running your water, not running your shower. It is to be remembered that we have been made to feel the blame of pollution. The individual is responsible. Recycle, pick that bottle up. Don't run the water while you brush your teeth. Well, guess what? While we were so busy turning off our taps and mucking around with peanut butter jars and cleaning them out for recycling, the petroleum companies were having a heyday doing whatever the hell they wanted and truly messing up the environment while we were kind of distracted with our small individual events. And I'm really trying to not let that happen, where my battle becomes a tiny squirrely battle of me trying to recycle 3 cans because school doesn't have recycling and forgetting the larger issues. So now I'm trying to spend my time when I'm on a building site and the client is telling me that they don't have enough parking spaces for me to rip up the sidewalk, or they really don't have the money for me to process the rain so it can infiltrate. That's the battle I want to fight. And so what I'm trying to remember when I'm working is that nature is my client. I'm working for nature. I'm working for natural processes. I'm
Stacy?
not running around making craziness of recycling. Yep.
I just wanted to tell you that we were out of time.
Oh, okay.
I
We
kept
should go.
trying to find a great, because you just said a whole bunch of really wonderful things that we could end on, and the bigger picture is definitely one of them.
Good. Well, head on out. That's great.
Stacy, thank you so much for your time. We all really enjoyed your talk so much, and your work.
Good, good. Okay, great. Let's let the discussion begin and keep nature as your client.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy.
Bye.